Hello and welcome to a special episode of Material Matters with me, Grant Gibson. As regular listeners will know, the usual routine is that I speak to a maker or designer about a material or technique they're intrinsically involved with and have spent their careers honing to discover how it's changed their lives. However, every once in a while I allow myself to break that self-imposed format and chat to someone who has an overview of the worlds of art, design, craft and architecture. Today my guest is Deyan Sudjic, who I think it's safe to say has had quite a career. He's been a writer and design critic for the likes of the Sunday Times, The Guardian and The Observer. In 1983, he launched the influential magazine Blueprint, while in 2000 he became editor of Domus. Not only that, but he's also director of Glasgow, UK City of Architecture in 1999, and in 2002 he headed up the prestigious Venice Architecture Biennale. He has published an array of books, including The 100-Mile City, The Edifice Complex and The Language of Things, while in 2006 he took over as the director of the London Design Museum. Since then, the institution has moved from a former banana ripening warehouse in Shed Thames to the shiny building on Kensington High Street, where I find myself today. We're going to be talking about his career, but also the changes he has witnessed in the design world over the years. Deyan, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you for coming to the Design Museum.
That's my pleasure. It's a reasonable intro. Did I get everything right?
Yes.
Good, I'm glad. I'm keen to talk about the Design Museum and the design world in general, but I thought it'd be interesting to start by talking about you and your background. So I'm interested in when you decided you wanted to write about design and architecture.
I studied architecture at university and realised quite quickly that though the subject was fascinating, I was both incompetent and impatient. So though I'm a bad loser, I hate to be removed from a course I'd started on. So despite the best efforts of my professors to get rid of me, I did actually get the degree and then immediately switched to becoming a writer, which gives you a much more instant sugar rush of satisfaction from seeing your name in print. It's also a fantastic chance to spend a lot of time asking other people questions, and in a way it was a chance to learn and to start to kind of explore. But always architecture and design were the themes, and from very early on also I was always trying to explore the subject from a point of view which was not only rooted in the professional, almost religious view of the subject. I wanted to talk to people who were not embedded in architecture or design. I was very lucky early on at the Sunday Times. I had a sub-editor, a species that no longer exists, of course, who said, never use the word fenestration when window is quite good enough.
But before that, can we take you back before that? Because you were involved in Oz Kids in, 1970, which ended up in an obscenity trial a year or so later, I believe, involving Felix Dennis, amongst others. How did that happen? How did you become an Oz Kid?
Oz, for those of your listeners who are too young to remember it, was one of the manifestations of the summer of love of a generation of, what were they called? Hippies, young people, who saw the world through acid-coloured glasses. And Oz was a kind of wonderful print summation of all that. Martin Sharp made extraordinarily beautiful covers. It was started by Richard Neville and Jim Anderson, two Australians who came to London in the 60s and produced this magazine, which was alternatively obscene, marvellous, revolutionary, self-indulgent. And they had the brilliant idea of really outraging people by having a school kids version of it. And the deal was that they claimed that they were going to recruit a bunch of school kids to edit an issue of the magazine. And being an ardent careerist, I and two other, actually still friends of mine at school, nominated ourselves and found that we weren't being given sole charge of the vehicle. We had to share it with the existing editors. And it was an extraordinary moment, but also in some ways a somewhat chastening experience. The cover was a notorious image, a found image, not chosen by any of the school kids, which I would have to say is sexist, to put it mildly. And it was only afterwards that I realised how upsetting and offensive it was to people that I respected.
Because you had Charles Shaw-Murray was part of the group and Peter Popham. I mean, it's quite a collection of people.
As I say, a bunch of careerists.
Charles Shaw-Murray compared it to the Lady Chastity's Lover trial. Do you think that's fair comment?
I don't think that Oz had quite the same literary merit that Lawrence has. There's some things that you carry with you, and I suppose the fact that I was an Oz school kid is something which pops up every so often. It was a long time ago. I kind of enjoyed it. I'd always found the idea of magazines interesting, I suppose, and it was the first magazine that I had any involvement with, even in America. Actually, it's not the first magazine. Even at school, I think we were producing school magazines, so it's always been there. I mean, mainly for me, my craft object is the magazine, an artifact made of paper, photographs, and words.
And you had a crew cut, Dan, in the photograph there.
You're very well informed. It was actually, it was absolutely worse than a crew cut. It was actually a skinhead shave. And of course, every so often you get fed up with your parents telling you to get your hair cut. So I did it in the most extreme manner possible.
So I diverted there, but your father worked for the BBC World Service. Is this where the interest in journalism came from, I wonder?
My father was a journalist for a long period in his career. He and my mother were both born in what was once called Yugoslavia. And he was both a BBC journalist, and then for a while he was the head of the Yugoslav news agency in London, Tanjug. I think that one of the reasons I actually studied architecture at university was my mother was determined I was not going to follow in his footsteps.
Right.
My father was charming but hopeless.
And they came to the UK because of the Second World War? Or
no, they came to Britain because my mother had a year's postgraduate scholarship to do English at Edinburgh University, and my father romantically followed her. He learnt his English going to the cinema a lot. And they were actually both members of the Yugoslav Communist Party, and the party advised them to stay in the UK when the war started here. It took longer to spread to Yugoslavia. The party felt they needed friends here.
Right.
When Tito came to power, my father had a kind of job in the embassy and then at Tanjug, the news agency. After the war, they returned to Belgrade, in fact, and luckily for me, they lost their faith in the party, and they brought my two brothers, born in London, yanked them from a prep school in London to the Belgrade of the early 50s, and realised that party members had enough to eat and their friends who weren't in the party didn't, and decided for the good of the family they wanted to return to London.
Interesting. It was the first pocket of resistance in the Second World War, wasn't it, Yugoslavia? Mihailovic and Tito,
this was
and the partisans.
This was 1941 when the Germans invaded Yugoslavia with the Italians on the coast, and it was an extraordinarily bloody time, and the country collapsed into neckline warfare. Interestingly, it was actually where Ettore Sotsas spent much of World War II, which I looked into a lot when I wrote his biography.
That's quite intriguing. I did not know that. What was he doing there?
He was in the Italian army. He was a lieutenant in the Alpini, based in Montenegro. He was interned when Italy collapsed in 1943 in Sarajevo, and offered the choice between a concentration camp or joining Mussolini's reformed army, which he actually did. But what would one do in those circumstances? I don't know. But yes, so there's some rather wonderful drawings that survive from Sotsas's time there. He obviously wasn't spending too much time fighting. He had a series of girlfriends of economical nature, a Catholic Croat, a Serbian Orthodox Christian, and a Muslim girl in Sarajevo. Imagine the damage he wreaked after he left. But he really got very interested in the textiles that were being made in Yugoslavia by the peasants. He commissioned some work. He made some other wonderful watercolours which survive in his archive, showing the patterns and the prints that they were working with. And one day I actually found in the archive in Parma in Italy, where most of his drawings are, this day when he ran out of ink, and all that he had was a pen. So he drew the pattern and described each of the colours in words rather than in watercolour. Really extraordinary moment when you realised suddenly how much colour mattered to him.
It's interesting. I'm kind of intrigued by, I mean, you've written a bunch of books. We're looking at Norman Foster poster in your office here, for instance, from designers and architects with quite different aesthetic styles. You commissioned Jan Kaplicki to do your flat back in the day, I seem to recall reading. Do you have an aesthetic style? I mean, we talked about not being an architect, but you studied briefly, I think, or finished up at Chamberlain, Powell and Bond, who obviously did the Barbican. Was that the kind of stuff you were into at the time? How come you ended up there?
Chamberlain, Powell and Bond was 6 months of pure humiliation. I found myself constantly unable to fulfill even the most minor of tasks. I respected the office very much. I thought the Barbican was a great building, but my contribution was to actually, unfortunately, drop a bottle of ink over the ground plan they were specially drawing for publication in the Architectural Review. I think it's that idea that you spend a year in an office as a student is enormously important, and it taught me my limitations.
But aesthetically, I'm wondering where you sit. Because I wouldn't think of you as a postmodernist necessarily, but yet you're intrigued by Sottsass.
I don't think Sottsass is a postmodernist either. I think there's nothing more boring than a critic, what they're going to write about. I think you need to take a view. I'm interested in things which are interesting.
You talk about not becoming an architect because you lacked patience, as well as, which I'm always quite intrigued by. We've talked about this before in the past briefly, but then you write books, which you need lots of patience for, don't you? I mean, it's quite a lonely business writing a book.
I love writing. It took a while to make the transition from journalism, which is 1,000-word sprint, to 100,000-word book, which is a marathon, and there are times when you do feel that you are trying to push through the pain barrier. There's that sense, is anyone actually going to read this stuff? What is it? But then it's really a kind of wonderful chance to explore, to ask questions, to be curious, to discover stuff. Whether it's in the Sottsass archive, discovering the way that Sottsass knew he was going to be famous. He kept everything, every letter, every sketch. Finding his fascist party membership card was quite a moment. That is great, to actually spend time thinking about things. It's a privilege.
Did they come to you for Sottsass, or did you pitch that? How did that work?
When I was editing Domus, I got to know Sottsass reasonably well. We'd have lunch together once a month, and somewhat shocked when he died. He was 90, but and I felt that I would really like to write about him. There wasn't enough in English. He'd written his own memoirs more than once, but they're not linear, and they're not entirely reliable. He told the same story slightly differently very often. And I wanted to capture something of that. But I think you need to do someone who's an important figure justice. So it took me a long time to work out what to say and how to write that.
Yeah. I mean, we're scooting around a little bit, which is absolutely fine. But we were talking about you beginning to become a journalist. I think you worked on building design.
It was my first job. Peter Murray recruited me to work on building design, which was the idea of being paid to write. It was fantastic.
Can we describe what the architecture press was like in those days?
Well, there was the upstart building design, which was housed in an extremely ugly tower block in Woolwich, which had the look of the front page, one of those black and white movies with a lot of smoking going on. Paul Finch kind of as the news editor. And then I moved to the entirely different surroundings of the Architect's Journal, which was in those days part of the architectural press and housed in a very elegant series of Queen Anne townhouses just next to St James's Park, where the pub in the basement that was created by Betjeman and Pevsner with stuffed lions and mirrors from bombed out Edwardian pubs was an extraordinary privilege. And being extremely snotty, I was made a bit of a fuss by insisting on producing my own typewriter rather than writing longhand and handing my copy to the secretaries that typed it out, which is what everybody else did.
Well, you always seem to have more than one job on the go, Deyan. I mean, you were also working at Sunday Times, being their critic at the same time?
No, I was writing for The Guardian at
the Guardian.
Time, yes. Well, again, it's how do you build a career by adding things, it's the fact that people could actually make a living writing about architecture and design for a newspaper was quite a remarkable phenomenon of the time. But you had to do several things to get noticed. So eventually, I worked initially freelance for The Guardian. At that time, there was not one critic. They were using lots of people as competitors. Then moved to the Sunday Times and eventually got a job at the Sunday Times. When Andrew Neil arrived as the editor, he said, "Oh, we must be a quality newspaper. We've got an architecture critic." And then while there, a group of us started Blueprint, initially in my flat in Docklands, and then that became a much more serious business, which then spawned various other titles, Magazine, which Rick Poyner started. We started contract publishing for the Tate, the Prince of Wales. We did a magazine for his institute, which was perhaps not quite the most obvious thing to do.
Interesting, at that time particularly.
And then it was about then that I began to start curating. So I did an exhibition at the ICA about contemporary design. And then Peter Murray and I were brought in by the Royal Academy to do a show about Foster, Rogers and Sterling, which was a kind of riposte to the Prince of Wales to show that there was architectural real quality in Britain.
I mean, can we talk about that time? Because you kind of already touched on it, but it seemed to me that Blueprint landed at a moment where Charles was in his difficult phase, I guess it's safe to say. I mean, did it feel like you needed to defend contemporary architecture and design at that period?
No, quite the opposite, actually. I think as every generation succeeds by trashing its predecessors. And I suppose we were trying to show that the architectural review had become really dull, and it was stuck in by covering the work of a group of architects who had also become rather dull. And so we tried to do things differently, and we attached ourselves to what we saw as a rising generation and rose with them.
Because initially Blueprint was going to be 10 issues, I think I'm right in saying?
Yes, I mean, the idea was that it was never meant to last. So the format, which was newspaper-like, as we told ourselves, could not be filed. And it was a cooperative. No one was paid for their work. We did it for fun. And of course, once you've got something going, it's very hard to see it die.
Yeah.
So it was transformed into a business. We raised some money, got a proper office. And for a while, we were actually in a building in Kramer Street, just off the Marylebone Road, in which David Chipperfield had one floor, Sebastian Conran's design studio was another, and the 9H Gallery, which became the Architecture Foundation, was in the basement. It's now been turned into Waitrose's loading bay.
And during this period, I mean, you've emerged as one of the leading design critics in the world. I mean, what do you see the role as a design critic as?
It's a very difficult question to answer, and I suppose the world is a very different place from when we started. To me, the starting point was that this stuff is interesting and it matters, and I have the passion and the conviction that I want to tell the world about this stuff. I find it's fascinating, so I want to share that fascination. But of course, that's not criticism. Criticism is engaged with the practice, and it's there, I suppose, to shape the conversation, to explore what it is that people are doing, to not to say this is good or this is bad, but to try and provide some kind of context to explore the meaning of work as well as its appearance.
Do critics need to be right? Is that important?
They need to be interesting.
Yeah, which is different.
Well, and I think the more you go through life, the more you see things are very cyclical. Upstairs in the permanent collection of the Design Museum, we have a physical representation of Lever's law. And Lever was a very gifted curator at the V&A in the 1940s in the Department of Costume, also a novelist. And half tongue-in-cheek, he produced what he called Lever's law about fashion, which is basically a year ahead of its time, something is outrageous. 6 months ahead of its time, it's daring. Of its time, it's chic. 6 months later, it's old hat. A year later, it's dowdy. 5 years later, it's frightful. But if it survives long enough, it moves to being quaint and then charming and then beautiful. And of course, fashion moves much more quickly than that. But it's certainly true of architecture. in our building here, the Design Museum, in 1962 was the Commonwealth Institute, and it was the most daring building in London. 20 years later, it had become a very tired piece of 60s-ness, which nobody rated very highly. It's now a listed landmark, and you need consent to touch anything. And that, I think, applies very much to the way that people see opinions about design. You know, who'd have thought that brutalism could suddenly become the new Victoriana, for example?
Indeed. And it's quite interesting the way that you look at, from architecture through fashion, graphics, exploring every discipline, which, I mean, a lot of people in the architecture press stick to architecture. There is a hierarchy, whether one likes it or not, in the arts world, and architecture is often interpreted as being higher than design, I would argue. Were you determined that you were going to look across disciplines throughout your career?
Blueprint was really influenced by Domus. And Domus was a place in which you could find committed writing about art. You could find people looking at car design or fashion and architecture and theory. And that was always, to me, seemed like a way to make something, a broader perspective rather than the kind of narrow tribalism that can happen if architects only speak to other architects or graphic designers only speak to other graphic designers. So that was always there. But personally, I suppose it was, if you start off curious, you always naturally want to go and explore the next thing and the next thing. So I was very lucky early on to meet some really interesting artists. I can remember 2 days in Paris in the 80s, meeting Donald Judd, having dinner with him, talking about his work and the way that he saw, Judd, of course, made furniture, he made buildings, and he was primarily an artist. But to talk to someone like that and get that sense and that perspective was a privilege. I've said that before, but and just gives you a different perspective. And the way I've written books, of course, maybe one could see these as being a scale shift. So I've written The 100-Mile City. I've also written a book called The Language of Things. So one goes from the giant scale of the city to the object. And over the years, I've seen more and more art and started to think about what art means. It is a different area, and it's not my expertise, but it's certainly something which I found more and more interesting.
I mean, you talked about Domus, the renowned Italian architecture and design title that's been edited by people like Alessandro Mendini. I mean, you took it over in 2000. Presumably, it's a very different job taking on a magazine that already has a heritage and a history than it is launching your own title.
Could not be more different. The budget was good too. And yes, it was being given the keys to a Rolls Royce. In the early 2000s, Domus was still had the resources to actually allow you to fund photographers to fly to Hong Kong, to get writers to go and talk to people and see things, and very lush production values. But of course, you also did feel rather self-conscious about actually sitting at the desk that Gio Ponti had designed for his own use in the office, which wasn't actually in central Milan anymore. They had moved to Rozzano, which is not the most savoury part of Milan. But yes, of course, you were aware of what had gone before you. And as an editor of a magazine, you try to do it as well as you can. You can do it for a while. I don't think people should edit magazines for too long, because it starts to, unless you know what's right to include in it immediately, when it starts to become too tortuous to decide content, then you should stop and move on.
That's quite interesting, because I was going to ask about lifespan of editors. I reckon you've probably got about 4 years generally. But you're at Blueprint for, really quite a long time.
I was, but in that time I wasn't, Rowan Moore became the editor while I was still there.
Right.
So, and we brought in some guest editors too. Jan Abrams, for example, did a great job for a year. But I suppose Blueprint went through phases. The first year was one particular thing, and it developed as time went on. But no, there were for me, Blueprint was a learning process. It was really Simon Esserson, the art editor, who taught me how to make a magazine. Simon is an exceptional, gifted designer who actually starts off by reading the content, and that's a very powerful thing to have. And then Simon and I also worked together at Domus. And that's, fantastic to have the kind of sense of seeing things the same way, that, we could just communicate really very, very directly, and reinforcing each other's contribution.
I mean, how did you work it? You were living in Milan or living in London and commuting? How did
My
that
family
work?
was in London, I was commuting to Milan.
So after Domus, I think you had short spells at the Architecture Foundation in Kingston.
Architecture Foundation, well, actually just before I went to Milan.
Okay.
So I moved from, I did 4 years in Glasgow running the architecture and design year, then the Architecture Foundation, and I also started writing every week for the Observer at that time, and did Domus, then came back, wrote The Language of Things. Was it Language of Things? Yes, it was Language of Things. Or was it called
Edifice Complex.
Edifice Complex. And then I spent a year as Dean at Kingston, which was enlightening in the same way that my time at Chamberlain Powell and Bonn had been. Kingston is a great school of architecture, design, fashion and art, merged with the Polytechnic and is now Kingston University. It's the place that produced James Irvine, Jasper Morrison, David Chipperfield, Eric Clapton.
Matthew Hilton went there as well.
Indeed. But as a dean, I guess your job is to try and explain to a university administration why art students need 24-hour access to a studio, and was not my forte. So I was very quickly looking for the next thing to do, and I was all set to move to New York to be the chief curator of architecture at the Museum of Modern Art. And then suddenly I got a phone call from the Design Museum saying, we're looking for a new director, and the job will be to find a new building and create that. And it's usually I make up my mind pretty quickly, but it took a while to work out that staying in London was definitely the best thing to do.
Well, I was going to ask you, because I'm intrigued by what you found when you came to the Design Museum. Obviously, there'd been quite controversial. Alice had left. There'd been a lot of newspaper headlines about it. What did you find when you walked through the door?
The Design Museum in Shad Thames is a very different place from what it is now. It was smaller physically. It's 3,000 square meters in the old building. About 150,000 people a year went there, and there's about 35, 40 staff. We're now 110 staff, 600,000 visitors a year, and we have 100,000 square feet, 10,000 square meters. It's the next step. Alice did a great job, I think, at transforming the original idea of a museum of chairs and the traditional idea of good design, good form, into something which had a more open approach. She was interested in all kinds of aspects of design beyond the physical. She did shows about websites, which was pretty prescient in early 2000. And for whatever reason, her vision didn't coincide with James Dyson, who was the chairman of the trustees then. So the job was to grow the museum, to shore up its position. I mean, when directors leave without a replacement in very sudden circumstances, you need to build a sense of stability again.
Yeah. But your brief when you arrived was to find a new building from day one.
Yeah.
Interesting. And obviously you'd curated and run things before. As you said, Glasgow 99, Venice Biennale 2002. So I wonder what the key differences are between your old job of editing magazines and what you do now.
Well, journalism is essentially a very selfish activity in which you believe that other people are a nuisance, that they get in the way of your attempts to express yourself. So, of course, you believe as a writer that you can write the best possible headline and do the best possible layout. And it's quite brittle, and I think journalists, after a while, start to get the sense of people are only speaking to me because of my job title. So it's great for a while, but you shouldn't do it for too long. And what Glasgow really taught me was that you can actually have as much, if not more fun, working with very gifted people and giving them a chance to do things that satisfy them as trying to do it all for yourself. So that was a very important shift, and understanding how you work with bright people is the big difference in terms of organisation. As an activity, Rick Poyner, the founder of I, once said to me very acutely that no magazine you'd ever want to read yourself will ever sell more than 10,000 copies. Whereas a successful exhibition here, like the Stanley Kubrick show, will sell 100,000 tickets or more. And you realize that's a very different process. It requires immensely more preparation. It's a massively different budget. You spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on a good show. So it has to be a more long, drawn-out process, and maybe more like a work of architecture. And with a magazine, if it's monthly, you can afford to bury your mistakes very quickly. It's not quite the same with a museum. So the biggest shift is that of the time factor. You need, ideally, to plan 3 years ahead, if not more.
Which is more like architecture.
Yeah.
Which is what you didn't want to do when you're a student.
So coming here, I've rediscovered the virtues of patience. And of course, the patience that it took to actually see the building built. It took 10 years, which was rather longer than I'd expected, but the results seemed very worthwhile.
And did you have a model in mind? You talked about, compared it to the National Theatre in some regards.
Physically, the National Theatre, which has multiple stages, each with their own character and a strong social heart, was certainly something I had in mind. I very much respect what Nicholas Sirota did with Tate Modern, in that he actually took contemporary art in Britain and made it something which was part of the mainstream conversation rather than something that was the butt of tabloid jokes. We haven't got quite the same scale, but I think we have done a lot to actually make a much wider public understand that architecture has relevance, architecture and design have relevance for them.
And now the building's up and running. It's been, 18 months or more?
Actually, it's almost 3 years.
Oh, wow, blimey. 3 years. Are there things that you wish you'd done in the building that you didn't do? Are there things that are working in ways that you hadn't expected?
We should perhaps have activated the atrium more quickly than we have done. My view is that when we moved, I wanted to see how the building would work rather than filling every square inch of it. The atrium is an important, very important social part of the museum. But the fact that it was actually quite restrained initially made some people misunderstand the building. But now I think we've brought that atrium to life in a kind of powerful way.
Because you got some criticism, I think, when you opened. I mean, Sunday Times was fantastically rude about it. As a former critic yourself, do you understand where they're coming from?
I don't remember that particular bit of criticism. As a former critic myself, well, I wouldn't say I'm no longer a critic.
Okay, as a critic yourself.
I suppose that it sort of inoculates you a little to some extent. I mean, you don't want people to be nice to you. You want people to tell you what they think. And
design, since you took over the Design Museum, the notion of what design is has changed enormously. There were no iPhones when you first became director. So I guess, how has technology changed the role of what you do here?
I think that's what makes design so interesting, that it's constantly reconfiguring. I don't think design is a thing, it's a method. It's like mathematics or philosophy. And your role as the museum is to actually explore how things come about, what they mean to the people that use those things, and what they mean to the people that design and create those things. And that can apply to a software package, to understanding the problems of aging. And so we're constantly looking at what's coming, but not, I hope, in a way which is simply celebrating novelty. I think the museum's role is to actually look at the significance and perhaps some of the unintended consequences of some of these things.
Because you have this extraordinary eclectic programme. I mean, you've had shows, at the moment you've got a show devoted to Stanley Kubrick's, the film director. You've also done shows on Ferrari, retrospectives on Alaya, fashion designer. How do you work your programme out, and are you looking at very distinct audiences for each show?
Well, the first thing to say is that we have almost no public money. Of our 10 million budget, about £300,000 comes from the Arts Council, and the rest has to be self-generated through a mixture of our own commercial activities, through ticket sales, through philanthropy and sponsorship. So we do actually need to have a strand of programming which people will come and see. So we do need to find ways which grab the attention of people, and find ways to tell those attentions, those stories in effective ways. So the key, I think, is to find a design museum way of approaching a filmmaker or a fashion designer or a car designer. So our show about Ferrari was not a conventional car show. We explored the extraordinary personality that Enzo Ferrari had, his working methods, how a car is designed, how a car is built, and who uses it. And similarly, I think with the Kubrick show, we've brought to life the extraordinary depth of planning, preparation, and craft that goes into making a film. So we need a strand of those kinds of stories which will grab the attention of a wide audience, but then, once that attention has been grabbed, give them insight into what design means. We also need to look at the wider world. So every year we do a project called the Beazley Designs of the Year show, which is 100 projects from around the world, nominated by spotters across the whole spectrum of what design is. So I guess it's like food. It's like running a restaurant. You need a kind of range of flavors and choices, and you hope to actually offer things which will break down some of those tribal distinctions. Graphic designers look at different things from car designers, who look at different things from architects, but you want to find a way to make all those tribes join the same conversation. But exhibitions are not all that we do. We work with young people. We have a very successful project known as Design Ventura, which is trying to reach out to schools throughout the UK, encouraging groups of pupils to compete to design a product which we sell in our shop, which they can actually use the royalties from to donate to the charity of their choice, which is really a tool to make young people understand how to make a pitch, how to work together, how things are made, what they mean. We have a good talks program, we show films. So the program is wider than only exhibitions.
I mean, can we talk, you raised the notion of how the museum is funded. This year there's been controversy over money received from the Sackler family to a slew of major British arts institutions because of its relationship with opioids. You had your own brush last year with the press over Leonardo, a company that's been trading in arms. I'm wondering, where, if you're running a building like this, where you can draw an ethical line with how you get your money and who gives you money.
It's obviously something which has become a huge part of the conversation for museums around the world. I think that to some extent the museum is seen as a surrogate target. I don't mean our museum, but museums in general are a surrogate target for if you're an arms manufacturer, it's likely that you will have your plant surrounded by barbed wire and protected by lots of lawyers. Museums are not that. Museums are open spaces in which the public is encouraged to come. So, of course, if you are an activist trying to make a point, then it's easier to do it here than it would be in a Leonardo factory, for example. But that's fine. We need to understand that.
Do you regret Leonardo coming in?
I regret the whole thing. Yeah.
Sorry, I disturbed your because I'm intrigued. It's not at this building, but I guess in general, it's something the arts world are having to deal with. And I'm wondering how you go about deciding what is ethical and what isn't.
Well, if you start to explore it, how do you make a differentiation between Leonardo, which makes helicopters and missiles, with the British government? And the biggest arms salesman in Britain is the British government. Does that mean we should actually not take money from the Arts Council? Should we actually refuse to let government departments into the building? I mean, there is not a kind of logical argument here, because the point of the protests is to make a visible public point. And once you start to actually argue about the rationale behind that, the arguments fall apart. But that's not really the point of the protest. The protest is there for visibility.
So how do you get around it? Or don't you just have to accept that sometimes these things are going to...
No, I think you do need to, of course, be aware of these things and judge every case on its merits.
Right. Okay, I mean, we're running out of time, Dan. I've taken plenty of your time up. Typical final question, I guess. What's next for you personally, And what's next for the Design Museum?
I think the museum is almost a start-up in that its shift from Shad Thames to Kensington gave it a very different flavour. We are now feeling at home in our new surroundings and very keen to make the most of them. We're looking at more exhibitions that will engage people. We are exploring activities beyond exhibition making. We think it's very important to explore some of the key themes which don't necessarily lend themselves to paid for ticketed events. So we want to look at ageing, we want to look at mobility, we want to look at artificial intelligence, we want to look at placemaking in ways which might be about exploring research in these fields, exploring hypotheticals about what are the implications of some of these subjects, which I think are a key part of the intellectual firepower of the museum. Me personally, I'm working on a biography of Stalin's favourite architect, Boris Yofan.
Very good. When can we expect that?
When I finished it.
That's a lovely place to finish. Deyan, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for coming.
And to learn more about Deyan's work at the Design Museum London, go to designmuseum.org. There are images from the interviews as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this from, and go to my Patreon page and make a pledge. You can find that at patreon.com/material matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.